Welcome everybody to our first webinar in this series on leadership in the moment and leadership in the future. My name is David Gammel, and I'm a principal with McKinley Advisors. I help co-lead the consulting practice. And I'm here today with Jay Younger, who's our president and CEO of the firm. And we're going to have an interview and a dialogue today. And this is the first of a series. With this crisis going on that's enveloped all of us, you can see we're working from our homes just like everyone else in this industry is right now. We wanted to get some content, some thoughts out there to help all of you, and really to help us to connect with you and share our perspectives as well. So we've got some questions today that we got from the community of CEOs in the association world, as well as some questions we have. And that'll really be our conversation today. So we'll talk for however long it goes, less than an hour, I think, and then we'll wrap up. And then we'll have some other really good webinars in the pipeline, so please tune back in. So Jay, why don't we start with, how are you? How's your family? And how's McKinley?
Well, great question, David. Thank you. And hello to everybody. We are good. We're fortunate here in the Younger household that everybody is healthy and safe. And we have, we've been sheltering in place, so to speak, for about 3 weeks, taking the guidance seriously, only going out when we have to. So, big picture, everybody here is good. And that actually is, from my point of view, most important. Pleased to be able to say the same thing about McKinley. We had already, over the last couple of years, been transitioning to a much more remote workforce. Several of our folks moved to new cities, towns, life changes. And so we had a fair number of people already working in remote status. And for any of our clients that are watching, we're often on the road for you. So we're often doing remote work, and I was thrilled to be able to kind of witness basically an overnight transition to full remote status. We have had one confirmed case of coronavirus within the firm. That person is doing very well, asymptomatic, feeling good, feeling healthy, actually back at work. But it became very real for us, very quickly. And so really, really happy to say that on all the most important things, we're in good shape. And feeling very grateful for that.
That's great.
How about you, David? How's your house going?
We're good. I've learned the value of having teenagers that like to sit around a lot. It's not been tough. And I've enjoyed having the time with them, which has been great.
It's true. We were talking about this actually this morning at breakfast. I don't know that this will ever happen again. I honestly, I hope it doesn't. But it's kind of a unique opportunity to bond as a family. Of course, there's a point of diminishing returns, as with all things, but it really does give us a chance to reset and think about being together and what that means right now.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the silver linings of all this, for sure. Well, let me jump into some of the questions we have, and the first one's from Peter O'Neill with ASIS. And Peter says, it can be hard to lead in any given moment. How do you suggest a leader show his or her true feelings while also remaining in control?
That's always a good question from Peter. I think in leadership, the first thing that comes to mind for me around the topic of leadership, which is how we're kind of, considering what we're trying to add to the community here in terms of our point of view, is the age-old quote from Peter Drucker that actually, our good friend John Graham used to quote a lot, which is, management is doing things right and leadership is doing the right things. And at a time like this, being called upon to do the right things is incredibly difficult because we've not experienced anything like this before. We don't have a playbook. We don't have a roadmap. We haven't seen this scenario unfold. And so I kind of go back to one of my own principles of leadership with it, which is authenticity. I've been counseled and mentored and taught over the years that we show up as our best selves as leaders when we can be authentic in the moment. And that's one of the reasons why I rarely use talking points or notes or try to script things too much, is because I do think that in moments of crisis, our teams are looking to us to be very human and very real. And I think we have to balance the care that we have with people with the candor that the situation demands. And so staying in control, I think, is really a question of motivation. I don't think we continue to work in an environment where traditional command and control structures are really going to be useful right now. We need to inspire people. We need to motivate people. We need to be authentic, show up as our best selves, and balance that care and candor literally on a daily basis as situations change. And so I think it's a tall test. It's something that, at least for me, has been challenging and has taken a lot of thought. But I do think, again, kind of relying on the skills and abilities that we've had, over many years, and built up that resilience as leaders, we're going to need it, and it looks like we're going to need it for quite a while.
Yeah. Thinking about candor and transparency, and then and control. And I might be interpreting this a little differently than Peter meant, but just as far as not creating undue concern with staff. How do you find that line? Like, you want to be honest about things, but there may be some things that it's not productive to share at a certain point that might be later. How do you manage that? How do you find that line, and how's it changed?
Right. I think it's really important to strike a healthy balance there. So I would say, first and foremost, don't lie. Don't tell the truth, right? I mean, don't, if you get asked a direct question, provide a direct answer. Don't try to hide. Don't try to, pivot away to a different topic. You have to address very real concerns that people have about ongoing continuity and viability in an upfront way. I would also say that I've learned over the years that as leaders, as CEOs, we have access to a lot more information and a lot more depth of understanding about that information. So if we're talking about financials, or we're talking about dynamics of business, we know it a lot better, and that's not meant to be dismissive of other members of our team. It's just it travels in our head 24/7. And so while some of us, our tendency might be to overshare, in these moments, I think a focused message on some of the key principles and key concepts of what is happening to the organization, what is our plan, how are we going to adapt. I think that is the right level of discourse right now. I think if you get too granular in the message, you're gonna lose it. You're gonna lose your attention. And so we've been focused on trying to communicate what our plans are. What are we watching? What are the numbers and the indicators that are going to determine how we're going to come through this situation, and provide regular updates. So we do it on a weekly basis for our full staff, to try and keep everybody plugged into what's going on, good news and bad news. And so I do think you have to be upfront about potential realities, but I also think you need to be careful to not box yourself in, because in a dynamic situation like this, we really don't know what's coming next month, next week, even tomorrow. So if you go too immediately to attaching a particular event to a particular lever that you're going to pull in the business, I think you box yourself in, and you need to maintain some flexibility in this environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think too, with everyone being distributed now, trust is so critical. So if you lie to your staff on anything, big or small, it's going to damage that so much. So
absolutely right. I think with transparency comes trust. And again, we often see, we do a lot of work in strategic planning, obviously, in core values discussions. Transparency is often one of the first things that people will throw out as potential core value. What we found is that, that word means different things to different people. Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't think transparency means sharing everything with everybody all the time. And in a situation like this, I don't think as a leader you can do that, because again, you can't tell everybody everything and expect for that message to resonate. And I think you need to be sufficiently transparent and sufficiently upfront to build trust in a way that is, again, a challenge when you're doing it totally virtually, totally remotely.
Yeah. Okay. Got one more question from Peter. And this is around leaders themselves and taking care of themselves. How do you recommend leaders rejuvenate themselves to remain whole in times that are particularly stressful? And I'd say these times are. So, for leaders who, are carrying some weight, how do they take care of themselves?
Great question. Look, we've been focused, I think so intensely now for weeks on most of the physical manifestations of what this virus is doing, to people. I think the psychological manifestations are, as dangerous in some regard, for all of us who now are, into week 3, in basically, isolation. Of course, we have our families, and don't get me wrong, there's nothing that's going to compete with the people who are truly on the front lines in the healthcare settings and the providers that are providing that care. And I think as leaders, we have to take care of our own mental health. And I think we have to be even more disciplined around barriers and boundaries in this day-to-day process. Each day kind of feels like the last. There's really no differentiation between weeks and weekends unless you make them, unless you honor the boundaries. This last weekend I started on Saturday morning. I came in here, which is now my office. Welcome to my office. I came in on Saturday morning. I sat down. I thought, wait a minute, I'm not going to do this because I have to have some sort of break if I'm going to be able to be my best self on Monday morning. And so I think it's even more important than ever to honor those boundaries. Obviously, physical activity is still permitted. You got to get out and run, walk, bike, do something to shed the mental detritus that builds up really quickly in this environment. So that's, those two things are what I'm going to. And then, again, try and think about, I'm an optimist by nature, so I try to think about what can we learn here? What is it that we're experiencing, and what can I chronicle as it relates to the tools that I might need down the road? And keep your imagination active. I do think one thing that we're going to continue to see is just a flood of information, right? Everything is coming at you. There are 16 webinars, and hey, here's one more from McKinley. But curating your own content and information that you're taking in, stepping away from the temptation to continually hit refresh on your browser and see what the latest numbers around the virus are. You gotta give yourself a little critical distance to be your best self as a leader.
All right, thank you. Let's move into a couple questions around workforce. This one's from David Akridge with American Inns of Court. Thanks, David, for sending this in. What do organizational leaders need to do, change, and develop to be able to lead teams that transition to a more distributed workforce model? So we've touched on this a little bit already, but how do we manage this, especially if it wasn't really part of the organization's experience or culture until now?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, we've been inadvertently preparing for this moment for a few years, and I'll say honestly, it's been hard as we've had to adapt. Again, we've had comparatively longer time horizon to get ready, unknowingly for what we had to do and flip the switch. But it was still a transition. We have had a tremendous contribution from a large number of our team at McKinley in keeping things novel and fresh and new ideas around how to connect. So we've got a number of examples. The one that just started this week, one of our team came back from maternity leave, and she said, "We all need some joy. We all need some happiness. And so here's some pictures of my new kid, and I'm throwing in a movie of my dog playing with the new kid, and I'm gonna pay it forward, and I'm gonna nominate a member of our team to do this tomorrow." And so we've now got this kind of chain email going around with moments of optimism, funny things that we found on the internet, little breaks in the action. We've also, not surprisingly, started the virtual happy hour routine every Friday afternoon. We all get together wherever we are. Well, we're all at home. We know where we are, and we spend an hour, 90 minutes together. We've had really good participation on that. We were talking the other day, David, that this Monday staff meeting, we had every single member of the company on Zoom at the same time. I don't think I've ever had a staff meeting where everybody's been there.
Yeah.
And so we found it, I think, to be pretty good in the kind of initial days and weeks. I think it's going to get harder as we continue to move on, particularly for people who are isolated that live alone. I think we're going to probably be more intentional about doing some outreach to those folks on a one-to-one basis. We've also established something called the kitchen, which is our virtual kind of hangout room. So if you need a break from what you're working on, you can pop into the kitchen. We've had some really good organic conversations spring up there. Using the technology to the best of its ability, understanding how it works, how to have a seamless experience is something that takes a little practice, but it's worth some investment. I've found that there are, and again, this is, I guess, not surprising, but it's been a little bit of a surprise to me that, there are still a lot of organizations who have no familiarity with this whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I'm hearing from folks that their biggest challenge right now is getting people to a point of comfort to be able to not go to the office. And we have people who still are really pushing on, the restrictions and want to go to the office because that's the only way they know how to work. I don't envy those folks. And I would say, something along the lines of get somebody who understands this and can be your champion to get people over those hurdles. Because that's going to crush productivity and any kind of ongoing continuity that we have. People can't adapt, but they might need some help. They might need some one-to-one time to get them over those hurdles.
Mm-hmm. Almost a year ago, you gave a keynote speech at SES's summer meeting Access, and that was around acceleration and disruption. And boy, are we feeling that now, right? So, thinking about our teams, our staff, how do we as a leader prepare them for just constant change?
Yeah.
To make them comfortable might be the wrong word, but just embrace it, that this is the new normal in a lot of ways, especially for right now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So the SES meeting last summer, where we met up there, and little did we know.
That seems like 10 years ago, but
right. So that talk, a lot of it was based on Tom Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, Accelerations. And the book is about what's happening in technology, in climate, and in globalization. And it's a fascinating read. And basically the premise of the book is that the pace of change in those areas has gone parabolic, that the rate of change is at such a level that our ability as humans to adapt follows a more linear pathway, and we're in this really dislocated moment. This was a year ago. Mm-hmm. Talk about feeling dislocated now, where seemingly overnight we've gone into a situation where we're in an unprecedented, context right now. So I think the Friedman's theory, I think, is pretty solid still. And so, I think one thing that I'm happy about, and I guess that we're fortunate about at McKinley, is that the majority of our workforce are under 30. And I say this, and not to be ageist, but millennial generation and Gen Z have grown up in a world that has already been accelerated. And for those of us who are a little bit older, we've had to learn what it feels like to have, the world's news at our disposal every second of every day. But people who have kind of always been in that environment, I think, are a little bit more adept at navigating it. And so I think our crew has managed beautifully to pick up the pace and be flexible. I think for organizations where, whether it's age or experience or context, where folks are feeling dislocated by this acceleration, I guess I would come back to Friedman and say that his premise is that he equates it to being in a raft, shooting rapids and traveling down a river, and the current in the river is fast, right? And you're keeping up with that. As the current gets faster, at a certain point, you're going to lose your ability to keep pace with the current, and paddling faster is not going to help. And so when you have that feeling of dislocation, when you have that acceleration that's happening to you, simply running faster, paddling faster, that's not always going to get you where you need to go. You have to take a pause and step back and think about how might we approach this differently. So one of the things that I would say is if we feel as leaders that our approach is not working and we're losing connection with our teams, if we're losing connection with our members, paddling faster is not likely to be the solution. It's likely to be a different avenue, a different approach that we're going to have to take.
Great, thanks. Let's go into talking a little bit about strategy. So we have a question from Cam Mackey with Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, SCIP. Says, given the current climate, we're all having to pivot and adapt. What are the best practices for leaders to encourage speed, flexibility, and risk taking in their teams? So those builds really on what we were just talking about.
Yeah. I think in this environment, you got to try a bunch of stuff. Again, in a certain regard, we've been given some upside opportunity here to try some new things. And I don't think anybody should be particularly disappointed in efforts, well-intended efforts to get something meaningful done. And so it's kind of taken that fear of failure that we've been counseled for the last several years to try and avoid, off the table. And I think that we need to be rapid in some of the prototyping that we're doing. We need to be learning quickly and adjusting on the fly. Obviously, while the virtual status and remote aspect of working in teams is different now, when you think about it, we really have saved a lot of time and energy around commuting, around travel. I haven't been on an airplane in over a month, which is probably the first time that's happened in years. Mm-hmm. So you've actually got a little bit more capacity than you think you do to connect with people in an efficient way. And so I think speed and agility right now, Cam's question is spot on. Mm-hmm. I think you got to use the tools to the utmost of the opportunity that we have. Have 15-minute meetings instead of 30-minute meetings. Come prepared. Be ready for action. I think in a crisis like this, and when we're dealing with a really uncertain landscape, as CEOs, we're often counseled in strategy to think way down the road, 3 to 5 years. And look, that makes perfect sense. Right now, I think our lens needs to be comparatively more narrow. I think as CEOs, we need to be thinking about what can we do this week? What can we do this month? Because, placing a large bet on what the world is going to look like in 3, 4, 5 months, I don't know that would be a good strategic bet right now. So I think bringing the frame of reference back closer to home is probably a good discipline, which again is a little bit outside of our normal domain when we're trying to think strategically about a long-term future. Yeah. And I will say, that there are tons of opportunities emerging for groups that are willing to carve out some percentage of their time to think about what we might be able to do, once things bottom and we can start to see a light at the end of the tunnel here. I think there are going to be massive opportunities for associations.
Well, it does seem, I agree with you, like we can't predict how, but it does seem like this crisis is going to fundamentally transform a lot of things about the world and how we live in it and how we interact with each other and how the economy is shaped. So that'll create challenges, but it's certainly going to create a whole lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I do too. If I were, if I were a strong association right now, and we've seen some disruption in the stock market, and I know that one thing in the good news category is that I think associations entered this as a whole comparatively stronger than I've ever seen them in terms of their balance sheets, in terms of their ability to weather a storm. Most groups went into this in a really strong position. And while we've seen obviously a material dip in the market, and therefore I can imagine, reserve portfolios. If I were a market leading association right now, not today, but pretty soon, I'd be thinking about merger and acquisition opportunities. I'd be thinking about consolidation opportunities. I'd be thinking about how can I grow market share, relevance, brand, value by being a little bit opportunistic and catalytic in a time when there are going to be a lot of distressed organizations out there. I think this, at one of many examples, that's something that would enter my frame of reference. Again, once we hopefully get to a point where things start to stabilize a bit.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I know you and I talk a lot about how important financial modeling is, and that's actually one of the things we have in our pipeline for webinars coming up. Next on the one on April 8th is going to be about that with Carly, Susie, and McLean Gift from our staff, talking about how to do financial scenario planning and financial modeling based on that. What kind of work do you think associations should be doing in that space right now?
Really rigorous work. really rigorous financial modeling and scenario planning with a heavy dose of dynamic variable input. Not to get too wonky here, but you're not going to know exactly what's going to happen. Obviously, if you've had to cancel or delay or postpone an event, you have a pretty good line of sight of what that's going to mean from a revenue and expense point of view. But some of the other things that I would imagine we're not going to know for quite some time are around the other revenue drivers. So the other business lines, membership, advertising, sponsorship, publishing, education. How are those business lines going to perform in let's say in the next year? I think that's really an open question. And so on the revenue side, I think you have to introduce some dynamic variables around what those could look like. And then commensurately on the expense side, what triggers do you have and what levers can you pull based on what you see on the revenue side? And so I think you have to be mindful of this, not on a daily basis, but certainly on a weekly basis to see what's happening in real time so you can adjust on the fly. One piece of good advice that we've received is to model a truly worst case scenario, because again, I think that this has hit us so squarely and so quickly, and again, not to be pessimistic, but if some of the projections around unemployment are even within the remote area of where it's going to land, 20 or 30% unemployment in the country, you need to know what that downside risk really looks like. It's going to be scary, but you need to model that for sure. We tend to find that the worst case scenario is not often the one that actually happens, but you do need to know what that is. And so I think the scenario planning in this environment becomes really important, and you gotta keep your board informed about what that looks like, and understand what are the levers that you have at your control, particularly on the expense reduction side, and when might you engage them.
Yeah. And I think that's so important with the boards, and going back to our theme of honesty, to prepare them, here's sort of the range of what can happen, because you don't want to surprise them at all.
Not at all.
And, so I've talked with people a lot about, how much you want to sometimes with boards to get them to make decisions in our previous normal environment, you need to get them to freak out a little bit, but not a huge amount, so they don't get locked up. But now I think you have to manage that panic that they're probably feeling, and justfully so, but still educating them about here's how bad this could be and what we would do in that scenario. And then here are better ones and what we would do there. And for them to understand the decision points they're going to have around it, and supporting you as the executive is really critical.
Absolutely. Never good at surprise board, as you well know.
Even good surprises are not good.
Never good at surprise board. And I think board, like any other group or team or community, they want to know that there's a plan. They want to know that you've thought through with an appropriate level of detail the full range of scenarios, and are prepared to act based on what conditions unfold. And so again, it's I would say it's a little bit different than the typical guidance and counsel that we give and receive to keep your boards out of the weeds. Get that, but right now is they need to understand with a pretty good level of sophistication the assumptions that are going into these scenarios.
Yeah. So we have a question from Bill Rowan with Anatomy. What did we learn from the Great Recession, and how can we apply some of those lessons in today's climate?
Yeah, wow. We learned a lot. I had been, so look, I had been expecting some sort of economic downturn for a while. I think most of us have. Our good friend and colleague in the community, Rob Alcott, and I gave a presentation at the Greater Washington Society of CPAs a few months ago, and still at that point, the economy was looking fantastic. So when we pitched this session about how to prepare for the next recession, it's like, why is everybody talking about the next recession? Well,
here it is.
Yeah, here it is. And boy, were my assumptions wrong. I didn't think we'd see anything like the, generational event or the black swan of 2009. The financial crisis was supposed to be, our worst. Well, 10 years later, here we are again in something that looks, to be an order of magnitude worse economically and on the human side, on the human toll it's taking. I would say, so we're going to do our annual EIA study in a couple months, and we're gonna revisit some of those, so the lessons that we learned in the last recession, because we want to remind folks of some of those things. The first thing I would say is that associations that continue to invest in their mission and in their members through the downturn came out the other side stronger, and they're the ones that gained maximum, I would say, brand equity, and their recovery was faster because they earned that trust, they earned that respect from their members at the worst possible time. And so again, when you have a strong balance sheet, one of the advantages that associations have, their tax exempt status is a true gift, not a gift. Okay. What is it, David? It's not a gift. It's an advantage. Why don't we say it's an advantage? And you have this capital to deploy at times of great need for your members. So I would just continue to reinforce that one of the things that we learned last time was those groups that were able to put some of those resources to work, even in a challenging revenue environment, that came out stronger on the other side. I think in order to do that, one of the other things that we learned and I think we remember is that you have to understand what the pain and the challenges are. So before you provide a solution, before you launch a new program, before you decide that you're going to intervene and try and create something valuable and new for your members, you got to understand the environment that they're dealing with. So you need to be in close contact with them. As challenging as it might seem right now to be reaching out, particularly if you're, let's say, a healthcare association and your members are literally on the front lines. I think that getting that intelligence from your members and your market is vital in order to be able to pick and choose where you're going to add value. So stay in close touch. One of the things I think that we learned is that the recession in 2009, 2010 did give associations an opportunity to, I'll say, prune their portfolios. They were smart in understanding where are the true value drivers for our organization and how do we focus our attention on those value drivers. It gives us an opportunity to look across that product portfolio with a more detached and clinical view and say, what can we afford to stop doing? What can we press pause on so that we can focus again our attention on the things that are really going to matter. And so it was a good opportunity for groups to do that. And again, we've been tracking this for years. The number of programs, the scale of programs, there's a considerable amount of stuff going on around the association sector that needs to be pressure tested. And I think this gives us a good opportunity to do that and scale back, scale down, and maybe suspend some things that are just not mission critical at the moment.
Yeah, if you can't prune back those sacred cows that have been lingering forever now, you never will.
That's correct.
So it's
correct.
It is the big opportunity.
So the other thing, I'm sorry, one other thing just popped into my mind. I remember being in a lot of those meetings, with boards when, the market was in free fall. Everybody was really, really nervous, rightly so. And there were end of the world scenarios being discussed openly. There was a really palpable sense of fear. In that regard, I think this is the same type of thing. We're all isolated now. We can't even be together to reassure each other. You know, I will say that I again, I hope I'm not going out on too much of a limb. We're gonna get through this. We're going to get through this, largely due to the incredibly talented and dedicated professionals who are helping us figure out how to have therapies and vaccines that will ultimately be effective against this virus. Many of whom are members of the associations that we hold so dear. But we got through it last time. We'll get through it again. And I think, again, kind of holding a steady hand on the tiller, trying to reassure people that there will come a day when we are going to see the trajectory of news change. We are going to see at some point, hopefully as soon as possible, that those curves start to bend toward the better. Yeah. And that will give us an opportunity to hopefully move forward with some new confidence.
Yeah, that's the main takeaway I have from the last recession, or at least there's a lot of lessons I think there, but the one that I find the most comfort in personally is we got through that. We will get through this too.
Yeah.
And I think that's the benefit of having lived a little while now and having gone through that experience.
The other, it's why I can't help but mention that in the immediate aftermath of the last recession, the Great Recession, as we call it, steps were taken and policy was established to prepare our financial services sector for the next time they needed to be liquid and capable of helping the country financially. And so our banks, our financial services institutions, largely through the stress tests I would offer that were established at the time, their capital ratios are much stronger. So again, in the good news column, our financial services sector is much healthier. Yeah. We've got good policy in place, at least for the small businesses in our community, to help us get through this. And so I do think, again, there are comparative bright spots now that weren't there last time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we learned how to manage this on the financial side through the last one, right? So hopefully that's going to go better this time and not take as long. So switching, I have a question from Kan Vu, who's with Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers. And he acknowledges this might be a little early to ask, but he says, what are the long-term ramifications of this pandemic on associations? How might this change how we serve our members, how we lead, how we operate as a business?
Yeah. So we've started thinking about this at McKinley, and I do think we're still in the exploratory phase. So I guess one thing that comes immediately to mind is around what is the future of association events going to look like? And I've heard a range of opinion on this, from, it's going to go back to the way it was exactly before the pandemic, and conferences and meetings and everything will just start up again. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that is going to be the responsible way forward. I think there's some very interesting conversations to be had in the months ahead around how do associations adjust their expectations for what the event part of their portfolio looks like. Mm-hmm. I think we're at a moment where, again, by necessity, our markets are having to learn what it feels like to work virtually now. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be a new openness to doing things with technology that there really wasn't an openness to do before. I think about some opportunities here, and Con, coming from SACE, I think this would be a great opportunity. What's possible if we start to think about it for scientific organizations? And David, I'd love your take on this. having run one for many years.
Mm-hmm.
The scholarly publishing business has already been under pressure with open access and the move toward that. Journals and publishing has been, an area of concern for many scientific societies. And when you combine that with what's happening now on scientific meetings,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a really terrible twofer that scientific organizations are facing.
Mm-hmm.
I envision a scenario in which those two functions, which are really both about the same kind of thing, which is advancing the body of knowledge in a field, how do you push those together in a way that creates a real new dynamic interface for scientists working around the globe to collaborate on their research in different ways? This would ultimately have to, show up in the academic setting in some way. But I think if you take the big publishers and the big event organizers and somehow think about what would it look like in a post-COVID world for us to foster scientific interchange at a much faster pace, where we can really identify, probably using AI and other tools, the things that are going to be most promising.
Yeah, I look at what's going on in the science society space through this. To me, it seems like the COVID crisis is going to accelerate trends that were already happening. So I see a lot of dialogue and a lot of publishers opening up their collections, if they're subscription based, anything related to this crisis, opening it up so people can access it freely. And there's already a strong trend towards open access. So I think this might accelerate that even more, especially in areas that are funded by government. So that may, it was already rolling along pretty fast, but may get even faster, or this may be the tipping point where it really flips significantly in that direction, which has huge implications for how science is funded overall, as well as how it's published. And then scientific meetings, a lot of organizations, they've been having tremendous growth. When I was with entomology, that meeting grew by 40% over 7 or 8 years that I was there in attendance. And scientists love to get together and network. That's how they find their future collaborators. So when meetings grow, it's because it's a really good nexus for whatever that discipline is to connect, share their science, but also to find old friends they went to grad school with, to interact and find new people to collaborate with. And it's a very efficient way of doing it. It's why they invest their grant money or the university's money or their own personal money going to the events. So, what happens there, I don't know. If that networking function can be replaced digitally at a satisfactory enough level, then that might lessen the need for in-person meetings or the demand for it. Or if the agencies and organizations that funded that travel decided they're not going to fund that anymore at the same level, that could also really drive it. And I think that might be the bigger risk, would be their institutions, their funders saying, hey, you guys can do this remotely. You don't need to go to those conferences. We're not going to pay for that. And that could be a big impact too. So for me, I think any organization that just looking at, what were the trends in your space, and going back to the scenarios, okay, what happens if those accelerate by 1,000% compared to the rate at which the change was happening before? And what does that mean for you? Because I do think this crisis, going back to the theme of acceleration and disruption, it's going to accelerate the disruptions that were already happening, most likely, for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's, before we wrap up, talk a little bit about governance, which, for people who don't know the association space, why do you talk about this so much? And we say that sometimes too, but literally cannot get anything done that's meaningful if you don't have your governance in shape, right? So I've got another question from Cam here. It says, nonprofit boards can be slow to adapt and make decisions. How should CEOs work differently with their board, and in particular in this moment, in this environment, so that they can, make decisions more rapidly yet effectively, but feel comfortable that they're fulfilling their duty as a board member at the same time?
Yeah. Boy, if there were ever an argument for right sizing your board and making sure that you have a competency-based governance model with the people who are well positioned to understand, assess, scenario plan, and make, a set of decisions that seem to be in the best interest of the organization. If there were ever an argument for it, this is it. I shudder to think about what's going on in some of our client organizations that have boards of 200, 300, 400 directors. I just can't imagine what it's like to try and facilitate that meeting. Fortunately, I have not been asked to do one of those yet. But in this, right? Open call, boy. We're game for a challenge. I think that this is Exhibit A as to why you need to really make sure that your governance house is in order, as you said, and challenge some of the assumptions about what responsible and effective governance means. In many ways, there are still hundreds and hundreds of associations whose governance models are based on representative democracy. There's nothing wrong with representative democracy. Don't get me wrong, but it is not necessarily the best way to govern a corporation, which associations are. They're nonprofit corporations, but in order to make smart decisions for the health of the organization and for the continuity of the mission, you need the right people on the bus, to borrow Jim Collins' phrase. And I would opine that you don't need 200 of them. You need the right people to be partners with the CEO in order to get to decisions quickly, effectively, and with full understanding. I think about a typical board agenda, particularly for organizations that I'd say there's a pretty strong correlation. So on the professional society side, board meetings are typically much longer. On the trade association side, they're typically much shorter. On the professional society side, I think about a typical board agenda that spans 2.5 days and brings people in from all over the world to sit around and listen to reports, basically. Yeah. And that's back to Khan's question. One of the things I think that really is overdue for change is around how we engage on governance. Mm-hmm. Look, there's no reason for that to happen 5 times a year for 2.5 days. And I think hopefully one of the things that could come out of this would be to get our partners on the board to understand that there are really critical things that need to happen, mm-hmm. Even in the best of times, and we need to focus as a leadership team, staff and board alike, on making sure we tee up an appropriate amount of time and space to handle those things. There's a lot of stuff that's not getting done right now on board agendas because of what we're dealing with, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think all that's probably okay. That committee report that we've been waiting 18 months for can probably wait, right?
Yeah. And I think, to educate your board about this as you go along, so I think if your system, and I think it's important to blame the system and not the board members, obviously, mm-hmm. But if flaws show up as you're managing this that are due to your system of governance, highlight for that for the board and say, you know why this is a problem for us? It's because our system can't adapt fast enough, allow us to adapt fast enough to adapt to the environment changing around us.
Right.
And again, never let a good crisis go to waste, which, effective executives always take advantage of that. And we know many of them in this space, but this might be the time for some organizations where getting the governance changed and improved is just, mission impossible. This might be the time where a window of opportunity is opening up for you to get that done.
I think it certainly gives CEOs entree to engage with their boards in a real conversation about. Now, again, I would say probably once we're through the epicenter of this pain, X months from now, I'm not going to predict when it's going to be, but to sit down and say, what can we learn from this? How did we, where did we perform well? Where were we deficient? How might this change our thinking about how we govern this organization going forward? And so I do think there's a real opportunity there. And I also think that there's going to be probably a similar counter force of board members themselves, of directors themselves, really wondering, why am I spending all of this time in support of this function when we were able to get it done, in a couple hours when we had to? So I think there's going to be, I expect we're going to see a little bit of a spike when we're finally released from our quarantine and we can go and associate with each other. I think there's going to be a lot of pent up demand to do that and a reunion feeling. But after that, I think people are going to want to, revisit some of those assumptions about how much they travel, how many hours of their day are they going to give, for, things that are not vital to their own families and their own organizations.
Yeah, and on the the positive side for leaders, this moment is a real call to service for everybody, from the executives, for their board members, for their chair or president, and they should hopefully look back on this experience when we get through it as one of the most important moments of service they had in their lives, given the role they had when this hit. Um, but I find people find that kind of work really engaging and interesting and fulfilling. And if they're not going to want to go back to listening to 20 reports read
Exactly.
for half a day before you actually get to something meaty. So I think to pay attention to that and to validate for those leaders, hey, you're doing important work. Thank you.
Right.
And here's what that work needs to look like right now, because they may not know. Execs are going to have to help them with that. But then as we get through this, to remind them of that, say, that was amazing what we did together. Thank you. Shouldn't
Exactly.
all of our board meetings be like that?
Exactly.
Hopefully not while everything's burning around us, but all of our meetings should have meaning and be valuable contributions. How can we do that? So that might be the way to crack that conversation open and move forward. Okay, well, we do have a webinar coming up on the 15th with John Hockman and Susanna Kelly. That's about effective decision-making with boards. So be sure to tune in for that.
Right on brand, right on topic for our last little snippet there.
Absolutely. All right, well, Jay, in close, I just wanted to ask you, what do you think is going to see associations through this crisis? What gets us to the light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I'm hungry for it. I want to see that light probably just as much as everybody does. I think we're probably a ways away from it. I think it's probably some combination of the same things that have always carried us through. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's a commitment to living our values, understanding what the enduring principles of our organizations are, and living those on a day-to-day basis. I think it's our spirit of collaboration in the sector. We are there for each other in ways that, again, if you dropped a Fortune 50 executive into an ASAE event or an association conversation, the level of sharing that goes on in our community, the support, the actual real support that we give to each other, sharing of our resources, our ideas, I think that this is another part of the CES talk that I gave, which is if we think big about our future as a sector, we can accomplish some really impressive stuff. I think this is again another call to arms for that. I think that we need to come together in new and creative ways. Just in one short example that I was talking about with somebody the other day, this is back on the events topic. There is technology now in most major cities. They're called telepresence rooms, and it's basically Zoom on steroids. And it is really unbelievable to be in one of those telepresence rooms. You have this feeling of being in the moment with people in such a real way. One minor thing that 10, 15, 20 associations who share common point of view on the world and are in close proximity to each other, do one of those and we can share it. And come together in new ways to collaborate, to tackle the big problems. I think that spirit of collaboration, our values, and our leaders. We have tremendous leaders in this sector. We're privileged to know many of them. I hope at least a few watch our conversation here, David, and we're able to offer some point of view. But it's that leadership muscle that everybody's flexing right now. That will ultimately get us through. I think we're certainly not immune from business model challenges, and we're going to have to make some hard choices along the way. But those three variables in combination, I think, position us well. We can ride out the immediate pressure and get back to doing the really vital work that we do.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jay. And thank you all for watching. I hope there's many of you out there watching this recording. And more importantly, thank you for the work you're doing right now. It is really important. It is making a huge difference. You're going to see your people and your members through this. And if you need our help, give us a call. We're here. Thank you so much. Be sure to check out the rest of our webinars as they come up in the series, and enjoy your day.